Hi, I'm a recently retired public health doctor volunteering with the Insurance Collaboration to Save Lives, a nonprofit organization helping insurers to deploy targeted screening, testing, and triage to identify policyholders most at risk for sudden death or critical care incidents. So that you can assess my credibility, I'll give you a snapshot of my credentials. I went to University of Illinois College of Medicine, where I was a James Scholar and got one of the College of Medicine Research Awards. I was Intern of the Year at West Suburban Hospital. I've board certified in general preventive medicine, and I have 35 years of experience as a public health doctor. I worked for a state health department, for a nonprofit devoted to sexual health, and for the CDC for more than a dozen years. I have more than 100 publications that have been cited over 6,300 times by other scientists. That would include this important paper on a mycotoxin and birth defects, which has been cited almost 500 times, and a recent paper reviewing anthrax back to 1880. Today, we're going to spend a good portion of this talk talking about innate survival mechanisms, the way our bodies naturally respond when stressors kick us into survival mode. There are a lot of factors at play, and we'll cover many complex interactions. We'll talk about obesity and its overlap with metabolic syndrome, about carbs, including sugars, and how the body uses carbs and other fuel sources. I'm going to give you the bad news first and go over all the ways that we can inadvertently trigger our survival switch. Although fructose may be the most important, other triggers include dehydration, alcohol, uric acid, and umami foods. We'll also get to the good news. Where are those brakes for your survival switch? Diet has a big impact, but there are also other interventions, some of which are actually very easy to implement. Before I go on, note that my little switch down here is really more of a dimmer than an on-off switch. So far, we set the stage. We've shown that it's sometimes useful to have some extra fat and what metabolic disease is, and that it accounts for about half of our deaths here in the US. To understand why this is, we're going to need to go over some basic nutritional physiology. Your body is made up of three main building blocks: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Today, we're going to focus on carbohydrates. What are they? Carbohydrates are either simple or complex. Simple carbohydrates are usually either one ring made from carbons, oxygens, and hydrogen, or two rings bonded to one another. We represent the ring by hexagons. Glucose and fructose each have just one ring. Sucrose, table sugar, has two rings, which are actually fructose and glucose bonded together. Complex carbohydrates just have more rings. Dietary fiber has many sugars bonded together in a long chain. These bonds take a while to digest. And starch has many sugars bonded together in a very complex branched pattern. These bonds are easier to break down. High fructose corn syrup also has fructose and glucose. However, it's even sweeter than sucrose and has a higher proportion of fructose. It began to be used in the food industry in the US between 1975 and 1985. Sugar, a carbohydrate, has been consumed by humans at some place on the planet for about 4,500 years. For most of this time, until the early 1800s, the primary source was sugarcane, which was first discovered along the Ganges River. Not long after people started using sugar, an Indian physician named Sushruta noted that people who drank the liquid sugar became obese and developed symptoms consistent with diabetes. By about 500 AD, sugarcane had spread to China, Persia, Egypt, Cyprus, and North Africa. A Jewish physician of the day noted that he saw many people with symptoms of diabetes in Egypt, but not in Spain. Around 1200 AD, the Crusaders brought it to Europe from the Holy Land, and in the 1600s and 1700s, England imported sugar from the Americas, and Holland imported it from Suriname, where the crop was grown on plantations cultivated by slaves. In the 1820s, Napoleon built factories across France for extracting sugar from beets. Finally, in the mid-70s to 80s, high fructose corn syrup began to be used in food and beverage manufacture across the US. On the next slide, let's take a look at how much sugar we actually eat in the West. This graph shows a couple of things. Average sugar consumption in kilograms per person in the blue and blue to red line on the top, and obesity in older males in the gray line at the bottom. If you want to think of this in pounds, multiply it by 2.2. Most available sugar consumption data are from the UK, shown in blue. However, here at the end, available data are from the US, shown in red. It started at about 3 kilograms per year back here in the 1700s and ended at 66 kilograms per year, or about 145 pounds, which is more than 2.5 pounds per week. As noted on the previous slide, for about 4,000 years before this graph started, sugarcane was a source for sugar. Sugar beets began to contribute in the early 1800s, and in the mid-1970s through 1980s, high fructose corn syrup, often shortened to HFCS, came on the scene and made major contributions to sugar consumption. Note that the prevalence of obesity in older males, shown in gray, is low at the beginning of the 20th century, but had a significant uptick in the last quarter of the 20th century. At this point, you're probably thinking, I just need to avoid foods with a lot of fructose and I'm home free. Unfortunately, your body sometimes makes its own fructose through what is called the sorbitol pathway. Let me show you how similar glucose is to fructose. It only takes 2 steps to get from glucose to sorbitol, and then from sorbitol to fructose. The molecular changes occur here and here. There are a couple of triggers that turn on the sorbitol pathway. One of the main ones is having a persistently high blood sugar. Sugary drinks are notorious for raising blood sugar, and foods with carbohydrates that break down quickly, like potatoes, are also very likely to spike your blood sugar. One nutrient that can slow that spike in blood sugar is fiber. The take-home from this is that if your blood sugar is high, even from other sources, glucose can turn into fructose inside your body, and if the fructose gets too high, you know what that means: survival mode. What fuel does your body use? Food is kind of like a bunch of 2x4s. You could burn them and get some heat, or you could build something out of them. So let's just focus on energy. What fuel does your body run on? Like the electricity you get when you flip a switch or the gasoline you get from a pump, your body has an immediately available source of energy called adenosine triphosphate, which is usually shortened to ATP. We can think of ATP like a little battery. Its 3 phosphate bonds give off energy when they are broken. Well, ATP is very handy. Much of your energy is actually stored as either glycogen, which is a very complex polysaccharide, or as triglycerides, a storage fat with 3 fatty acids. Like uranium fuel rods or crude oil, both of these storage forms of energy need more processing to get used. Well, here's a menu you've never seen. We've already touched on this. What is it called when you convert food to energy or building blocks? Right, metabolism. Metabolism are the chemical processes needed to take food and turn it into either energy or building blocks for growth and repair. So let's just focus on the energy half of metabolism. What fuel or energy does your body use? What are the sources? Okay, this oblong represents a cell. The yellow background is what we call cytosol, and this blue capsule-looking thing on the right is a mitochondria. There would actually be hundreds to thousands of mitochondria in a cell, depending on their particular energy requirements. Let's look at the parenthetical information for a second. Starting on the right, aerobic pathway means a pathway that requires air or oxygen. And over on the left, anaerobic pathway means a pathway that does not require air or oxygen. Note that your body can get energy from carbohydrates, but also from proteins and fats. However, today we're just going to look at the carbohydrates and how they're broken down. The breakdown of sugars is called glycolysis. It starts here on the left, out in the cytosol, and there are many more steps than what I'm showing. If we break down one molecule of a simple sugar, such as glucose or fructose in the cytosol, we get 2 molecules of ATP. Not very much, but we also get 2 acetyl-CoAs. We'll discuss glycolysis more on the next slide. Both glucose and fructose participate in glycolysis. However, a major difference between fructose and glucose is that glucose metabolism is very regulated, but fructose metabolism is not. Acetyl-CoA is kind of like charcoal. It can get broken down much further over here in the mitochondria. Alternatively, it could be turned into fatty acids, which are a main constituent of triglycerides. When we put these two acetyl-CoAs into our little mitochondrial power plants, we end up with 35 ATP. However, unlike glycolysis, this process uses up oxygen and it produces CO2 and water. It's also called respiration. Glycolysis is not particularly efficient, what we saw over on the left on the previous slide. It would be like a power plant that needs 2 people to run it, and by day's end produces just enough energy for 4 people. Here I've shown the beginning steps of glycolysis again. You can begin with either glucose or fructose. What looks like a 2-step process on this slide takes about 8 steps. And at the very beginning, you use up 2 ATP molecules so you can add a phosphate to either end of your sugar molecule before you break it in half. Each time you do this, an ATP becomes ADP. By the time you finish glycolysis, you have made 4 ATP. However, since you used 2, your gain is only 2. Both glucose and fructose participate in glycolysis. However, glucose metabolism is very regulated, but fructose metabolism is not. With glucose metabolism, ADP is upcycled into ATP. However, if you dump a lot of fructose into a cell, then it will use up most of the energy in the cell on the beginning steps of glycolysis. And the ADP that is generated is broken down all the way to uric acid through some intermediates called AMP and IMP. Uric acid causes oxidative stress, and this dials back aerobic metabolism in your mitochondria. And the acetyl-CoA that you created will be shunted off into fatty acids, and from there to triglycerides. Once your mitochondria are dialed back, your body's going to say you need more energy, and you're going to want to go get something to eat or drink to address your perceived energy deficit.